very much watching. And from my country, I reserve my position and will look at it as a sort of quasi-judicial officer in due course.
And I think it was really interesting to know and to see that Peter and some other companies were actually present at the APA meeting in Vancouver, where you as the commissioners really wanted to do a deep dive and understand some of these implications, which is, I think, the right way to proceed with some of the caution. Peter, what about Google? Are you seeing these requests all around the world? People asking you even though they're outside the EU or not? I heard there was something in the US.
The vast majority come from Europe, and we do require on our form that people have a connection to a European country. We're doing that because, after all, it is a decision of the European Court of Justice, and people have to identify a country whose laws apply and to which DPA we would escalate an appeal, or they would escalate an appeal, and all that. We're seeing very few outside of Europe. There was a request from a Chilean businessman recently. He was, some other Chilean blog said something about him he didn't like on the Chilean blog. He complained to the Spanish DPA. The Spanish DPA ordered us to remove the link. We went back to the Spanish DPA and said, are you really sure? I mean, this is Chilean, right? This is not Spain. And then the Spanish DPA reversed their original position and then agreed with us and said, no, you Chilean businessman, you have no right to come to us, the Spanish DPA, to demand that this European right be applied to you. So that's a very recent decision just last week.
Great. And let me turn to Gabriela now. And Peter, you have actually mentioned the point of jurisdiction, and quite rightly you have decided to apply this ruling across Europe. Each of your entities is seen as a data controller, as it were. And so what are the repercussions of this decision, Gabriela, for other businesses? Perhaps both in substance, in terms of being sure to erase irrelevant, excessive data, but also on the point of jurisdiction. I mean, are we going to have businesses to claim even German or Dutch data controllers, sole data controllership, even if they're intra-EU? Forget about outside the US. What's going to change?
That's a very good question. Probably the discussion in this area has just started. What I found really remarkable about the Costilla ruling was that it anticipated an issue which is already under discussion in the context of the draft framework regulation and heavily disputed. So at a very politically seen, very decisive point of time, the European Court of Justice came up with the idea that European data protection law in its current status would apply also to service provider mainly located outside Europe. So I think for some providers, this kind of hit the alarm clocks even more. And overall, for a business in a multinational company as Deutsche Post DHL is, of course, we do not provide services as search engines. But overall, what you can deduct from that is we also engage very much in the e-commerce market, e-facilitation services, and so on. So, of course, there are parts of the company being located outside the US and probably providing, or in the future providing, this kind of services into the EU, which would subject us to the same conditions as inside the EU. So what can we learn from that? I think it's absolutely necessary to anticipate that, to be very cautious, to closely monitor the design phase of these kinds of services or perhaps even products, and also teach your business that there is no escape route via a smart location of your business. The global context is there, and it will be getting even more global. So I think that's about the time to think then also about a global privacy design of services and products. So that's, I think, the best thing to take away. And perhaps another second thought which came to my mind is it might well be that even not being a search engine provider, looking at the social networks, the internal social networks we use in the company, I think the ideas and requirements laid out in the ruling would also apply to these. So at this area, one could say this is a closed forum whatsoever, but nevertheless, probably these requirements also apply, and made me think that it's worthwhile to look at these. But so far I can say we haven't got any kind of requests in that respect, but it could well be that this will take place in the future.
Bjorn, did you want to
If I can just add a little piece of information about the dialogue I've had with the media organizations regarding this delisting or de-indexing cases. 4 or 5 years ago, we had this service in the DPA called deleteme.no. It was a place where you can contact us and you can get harmful content removed, hacking of profiles, pictures, harassments, etc., etc., etc. And we tried to get the media houses or the newspapers or whatever to remove some of the content or maybe make it not searchable anymore by de-indexing it. But they were very, very negative to do that. And also when this case came from the Court of Justice about a year ago, the media, they just raised their hand and said, this has nothing to do with us, we are not interested at all. I'm speaking in big numbers now, but there's no one from the Norwegian press here, so I won't be quoted on this. But that has changed. That has changed. So they have sort of, the papers have sort of gotten inspired from this court decision. And we had a meeting with them only, right after Christmas. And they are saying that they get a lot of, but quite a few, complaints from consumers, from citizens, having read something about them in the old papers that they want to remove. And they are never deleting anything from the papers. And I support that line. You should never delete or change an article. That's about freedom of the press. So you should never delete anything, but it doesn't necessarily have to make it, open up so that everyone can search on it, so you can de-index it. And that's exactly what the press in Norway has done, which I think is very positive. So they have also get some sort of inspiration by this court decision, and maybe also from the practice you have seen from Google.
There's some questions, I believe, in the audience. Gentleman there in the fourth row, I can't see you. Do you want to introduce yourself? Because we haven't got no right to be anonymous here.
Austria from Nokia.
Austria from Nokia. Sorry, I can see you now.
Interesting discussion, and I always wondered what's the implication for research and history writing if not only search engines but newspapers need to sort of limit the results for past news articles or events. How do we tackle that? Does that mean that search engines like Google or newspapers need to somehow come up with a new way to give access to this information for researchers? Somebody might be interested in doing history of escort services, where some of these incidents might be highly relevant in writing something that's interesting from a historical point of view.
Peter, yeah.
Well, we all know that the Costa doesn't require any change to the original content. So the original content still remains there. But the point is quite valid to the extent that people research via Google, which of course in the modern world many people do. One of the reasons that I wanted to come today here for this conference in Berlin was because for me personally, I just find Berlin is the most moving city in Europe in terms of the visible scars of history, and one block further on, the obliteration of history. I walk through the streets of Berlin and I see ghosts everywhere. I don't know if that's how you feel, but it's no better forum, I think, for a city that has to live with a difficult history. Do you live with your history because you have to assume it and it's part of who you are? Do you obliterate it so that you can move on as an individual? My father's from Berlin, half Jewish child who survived the whole war here. He said he was begging on this Platz, Pariser Platz, when he was 10 years old. So to me, that's really meaningful. That kind of history cannot disappear.
Mm-hmm. Any thoughts, John?
Well, I guess historians have been managing to interpret past events for us in very thoughtful ways for many, many years without the assistance of online search engines. So that's just one trite observation.
Good. There was a question there, I think.
Dawa Korf, I'm a human rights lawyer. Peter, for once I feel a little bit of sympathy with Google.
Thank you. I've been waiting for 10 years for that.
Exactly, finally.
And I think the court did put you between a rock and a hard place. I think on substance the court was right, but it didn't come up with a proper procedural answer. I think that really is a big problem. You mentioned a few things that sort of raised my hackles apart from your examples. You were talking about you distinguish between respectable journalists and not respectable journalists. You talk about the distinction between defamation and the right to be forgotten. In German law, French law, most continental law, that's a very US English law concept that defamation is only about truth. The continental systems extend defamation to no longer relevant information that's harmful to reputation. So there is an overlap there that is complicated. The Rehabilitation of Offenders Act, which is the equivalent of the New Zealand legislation that you just mentioned, that is, by the way, one area in which you could just ask each ministry to give you the spreadsheet. How long is there other periods for which crimes, so your group can easily check against it. That, for once, is a reasonably objective standard. And you also said IP laws are largely aligned. Yes, except when it comes to the exceptions. And it's obviously always the exceptions where it's difficult. The problem is that you are not the right body to adjudicate on this. And I would add, and I'm actually very pleased with the New Zealand Data Protection Authority representative, that he agrees he isn't either. Restrictions on the freedom to seek, receive, and impart information should be adjudicated on by a court, not by strange beasts like either Google or the data protection authorities. And it is a really tricky development in the context of the globalization of information that these laws all of a sudden are constantly competing and that the adjudication on it is in the wrong form. I don't know if that's a question, but I'll try to put it as maybe you have some comments on it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for all that. It is that complicated in the real world. It really is. Two very quick observations. We, of course, did not ask to play this role. Right? The court ordered us to play this role. Does anyone confused on that subject? So we are doing our best and most conscientious to try to play a role that we never asked to play and don't want to play. But we are playing because we were told to play it. When I think about the ambiguities of law, of course, and that's why we're building up this whole team and we're doing the best we can to try to put it all together. Should a court do this? Well, we had to go from scratch to having individual human Googlers in my legal department look at 1 million URLs one by one and apply these cases. So if there's a court who's willing to take that back, we'd be delighted to.
I think this is a really difficult question because, Dow, I mean, you hit the finger in the jam, or whatever the proverb is. In that, I mean, everybody has said Google is not in the right place, the right judge of this particular dilemma. But in data privacy law, data controllers have to make these type of decisions all the time. You know, we get requests for erasure, for deletion, for correction, and you can agree or disagree. When you're applying legitimate interest for processing, you, as a data controller, have to balance your interests with the rights of individuals and the impact and risks and harm. So I think